In fact, climate IPOs outperformed Nifty and broader stock markets over the last 18 months. So, which basically means that a new source of capital opens up when very large pools of capital are needed for mature segments of climate action.
Also, interestingly, what we found was public markets were investing in sectors that VCs generally don't tend to do. So, for example, if you take a segment like wastewater treatment, heat exchangers, solar pumps, these are all tend to be sectors where VCs will generally tell you, oh, the growth opportunity is limited or there's not enough moat in these places. But these were sectors which thrived in the public market.
Hi, wherever you're listening to this, I hope you're doing well. Welcome to India Tech Report, a podcast dedicated to chronicling and supporting the growth of India's deep tech and climate tech ecosystems. I'm Hari Arakli, and this is another episode of In Conversation. In this episode, I'm joined by Sareen and Shravan Shankar, co-founders of Climake, a climate finance platform and advisory. They talk about their 5th annual report on the state of climate finance in India. In 2024, equity capital deployed reached $9.4 billion, about double from the previous year for India, with public markets absorbing 60% of all funding. Simmi and Shravan also talk about some consequential shifts, such as the emergence of a public capital ecosystem that routes money to climate solutions that venture investors usually find unattractive. The two co-founders have formally tracked this evolution ever since they founded Climake in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and much longer in various capacities before that. Simmi brings to Climake 2 decades of mainstream finance experience, including at a global investment bank, and she has previously built a climate-focused fintech and debt platform. Shravan has built his career across sustainability policy, innovation ecosystems, and climate entrepreneurship. Their annual State of Climate Finance reports are increasingly widely accepted in the industry as investors look at India-specific decisions. In this conversation, they talk about what their 5th report reveals: a $2 trillion capital requirement through 2035, a substantive shift toward adaptation financing, and the expanding role of public markets in sectors such as wastewater treatment and solar components that aren't always attractive from a VC's perspective. The discussion spans emerging technologies from sustainable fuels and flow batteries to seaweed-based biochar solutions, the persistent gaps in growth stage capital for asset-heavy climate enterprises, and how adaptation will reshape investment contours as it becomes increasingly urgent. Here's a conversation. First of all, Simmi, Shravan, thank you both for making time for this. So I thought we've spoken about your work before and the previous editions of the report, but for new audience as well as generally for a more general audience who may not know about your work, it might be worthwhile to just take a few minutes to again have a recap, a bit of a backgrounder about why you started Climake, and then a little bit about the report, and then we'll go from there.
First of all, Hari, thanks a lot for having us on this podcast. And I know we've been doing this every year with the report now, so it's become a bit of a tradition. But let me talk about how Climake came to be. Climake is now 6 years old, and Shravan and I started this during COVID because we were trying to essentially answer the question of how much capital does climate action need, and what do we do to solve for the gap that exists to fund all the private investment that needs to go into climate. What Climate has evolved to over the last 6 years is essentially an advisory firm that is solving for 2 things. We believe that there are many investors globally who want to invest in climate. And if you look at, COP. We have one going on right now, but last year's COP, there was a proclamation that the global north or developed nations will invest $300 billion a year into climate in the global south. Uh, we believe that many of these investors need support in understanding and building thesis around new and emerging geographies and areas of climate action. That's one part of our work where uh, we write some public research. The report we're going to talk about today, the State of Climate Finance for India, is one of those. But we also work closely with investors, with development finance institutions, with limited partners who invest in funds to help them build investment thesis and conviction around how to invest in new and emerging areas of climate. The other part of the work, which is almost the other end of this bridge that we are building, is working with founders who are building interesting climate businesses in what we think of as edge sectors or new and emerging areas of climate action. And we mentor them, we help them figure out what kind of capital they need to grow and scale their businesses. And then we help them raise that capital from our network of investors. So that's essentially what Climake is, a bridge between founders who are building interesting climate businesses and investors who need to invest this capital and need to build conviction around that.
Can you both also spend a couple of minutes to just talk about how you came together, a little bit of your work before Climate and kind of, at that point where you both were and what are sort of the circumstances or the conversations between the two of you that led to Climate?
Shravan, do you want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we started Climake in the middle of COVID. Uh, as Simmi had, spoken about, both of us are veterans in this space, but we come from quite different perspectives. I've worked in, core climate sustainability, in building, innovation ecosystems, working with entrepreneurs, policymakers, a whole bunch of stakeholders around how do you mainstream and drive climate solutions. And it's always been a bit of an interesting arc to figure out, okay, what are the different ways that you can actually get this adoption to happen? And um, the two things that really struck me, which was pretty critical, was that anything that you do in anything that you need going forward in climate and even mainstreaming sustainability is going to require new solutions to come up. And the odds are a lot of these needs are going to be from very emergent entrepreneurs, new sectors, because you need just new innovation to emerge, because it's just not a space that because you need new solutions to really come about. And the second realization was there's always going to be a financing problem in really getting this to the scale that it really needs to go. Uh, because at least from the lens that I was in my pre-climate days was climate solutions are generally an alternative to something that's already there. So you already have to demonstrate and show, and this is obviously true carrying through, but it was a realization I had just before we started Climate, where we if we really want to make a solution effective, if we really want to see it pick up and go forward, the odds that it has to demonstrate are very significant. There's a barrier of, the comfort of reliability of whether a solution works. There's a cost element to it that you have to account for. There's just so many effective aspects that you have to solve for. And ultimately, it came down to this question on, can you access enough financing to actually enable a solution or an enterprise to scale? I don't come from a financing background at all. I was pretty terrible at it. I just remember I probably did something in university and schooling with an accounting course, but it can't pass for anything else further than that. So, and I let Simi take this part of the story up, but it was quite, and I'd met Simi, I think, once before. It was, I think, around 2017. I was based in Chennai. We did a session. We did an amazing session where, for one of the ecosystem groups that we were running, we did a session on alternative investment and financing. Simi was the one, basically wowing people who were there to think beyond venture capital. And in the middle of COVID, Simi just pinged me thinking that, hey, I have an idea. This is what I've been seeing in the space, but I'll let Simi kind of take up that story and connect it to what she had.
Yeah, sure. So essentially, I come from the world of finance. I spent the first 15 years of my career doing mainstream financial services. I was with a large global investment bank for many, many years. And then about 15 years back, I made the switch to focus on impact and climate. And by 2020, I had done a few things in this space, like setting up a fintech platform, helping startups raise capital from a debt perspective, uh, set up an NBFC that was looking at climate lending. So, largely looked at the space from a financing perspective. And and I guess mid COVID, I was mostly bored, but also looking for uh, data around what gaps exist in climate. And I thought it will be easy to find how much capital does climate need. But while I found like tons of reports that talked about theoretically what should happen and what the government should do and what policy should do, there was almost nothing from a private investment perspective. So that's when I called Shravan and asked him if he wanted to like jointly write this report with me that we thought would be useful not just for us to understand the sector, but for the broader ecosystem. Um, so we ended up kind of spending some time looking at what the capital stack for climate looks like, what it should look like, and writing our first State of the Climate Finance in India in 2020. And that's how we started. Uh, I think it took a life of its own after that. The
Yeah,
report got very popular.
absolutely.
I think it was something the market and ecosystem was looking for. But then we also brought in, like, organically our work around helping companies, helping investors into the same umbrella. And it's sort of now become like this tight knit, network that we have that we believe can really solve for the climate capital gap.
Uh, so can we now get into the report itself a little bit? This one's the fifth edition, right?
Correct. This is the fifth version of the report.
Okay. At the high level, can you walk us through what are some of the most interesting findings? And you can also give us a sense of what they reflect about how things are changing from last year or earlier years and so on.
Sure. This is actually one of our most interesting reports so far, I think. Uh, Mostly because I think the markets have evolved and become more vibrant than we've ever seen. For almost a couple of years now, we have been hearing more chatter, uh, more investors, more companies talking about raising capital, deploying capital. I think this is the first year when that shows up in data and numbers. So let me talk about the top three takeaways from the report that we have this year. And just as a context and background, the report is meant to cover how climate finance is evolving for India, both from the terms of what kind of capital is getting deployed, which sectors are gaining traction, and looking forward to the future, what kind of capital needs are there. So, top three takeaways, Hari, from this report. Uh, Number one, 2024, which is the last year we have tracked this data for and published this report around, was the most active year we've seen for climate finance in India ever. Just to give you numbers, equity funding of almost 9.4 billion was raised for climate action in 2024. This is almost double of what happened in 2023. Um, if you add our estimates for debt as well, we believe that overall, more than $31 billion of capital was deployed towards climate action in India. Secondly, we have seen a real uptick in the number and kind of investors that are investing in climate. Uh, for starters, if you look at private investors, folks who invest in private markets like family offices, venture capital firms, private equity firms, we had around 330 of them make at least one climate investment this year. That's the highest number we've seen ever. But even more surprisingly, public markets have started to look at climate quite seriously. And this was the first year ever that we saw that about 60% of all equity funding came not from like private investments like VC or PE investments, but from IPOs or from what's called PIPE, which is a private investment happening in an already listed company. So that was a big change and a shift we saw in the markets compared to last year's. Uh, and finally, our third key takeaway is more forward looking. So, up until last year, we were looking at markets from a what will happen until 2030 perspective. Um, but given that we're already in 2025, this year we made an attempt to do a bit of a crystal ball grazing into 2035 to figure out how much capital would climate action need for India in the next 10 years. And we believe that the total investment need for solving for the climate challenges that India has would be close to $2 trillion between now and 2035. So essentially, as I said previously, like up until the 2024 report, all of our estimates were built until 2030, which was when we started writing the report in 2020. We were looking at an estimate 10 years from now. So given that the more we see the effect of extreme weather, the more capital we will need to solve for that. Obviously, the total capital need for the 5 years beyond 2030 are much higher. What that means in numbers, Hari, is that previously we felt that we would need about $108 billion a year until 2030. So a total of about 760 billion. Uh, but now, if you go beyond that, we think we need about 170 billion a year.
And the point about money coming in, because of IPOs and investments in existing companies that are listed, did you mean? And what is the significance of that?
So there are two significances to that. Um, One, when private investors like VCs or Ps invest in startups, one of the key things that they look for is where will we exit to? And up until these IPOs started happening, you would usually exit to a secondary, like you will sell to another larger private investor, or you would basically look for a strategic buyer into your startup to exit your stake. Because every VC fund is looking for an exit when they make an investment. Uh, but if IPOs open up as a source of capital for the more high growth, scaled up startups, it means that people who come in early as investors, when they make investments in seed rounds or Series A rounds, now have a clear visibility that this company, if it becomes large and mature, can exit to public markets. So that gives them more confidence when they first invest in these startups. So that's one. But secondly, climate will also need capital at large scale when sectors become mature, as we've seen for areas like solar and wind. And if we have public markets who are willing to invest in these markets because they think that these are like sectors not only providing impact but providing market returns. In fact, climate IPOs outperformed Nifty and broader stock markets over the last 18 months. So, which basically means that a new source of capital opens up when very large pools of capital are needed uh, for mature segments of climate action. So it's a great positive for the sector overall.
And also interestingly, what we found was public markets were investing in sectors that VCs generally don't tend to do. So, for example, if you take a segment like wastewater treatment, heat exchangers, solar pumps, these are all tend to be sectors where VCs will generally tell you, oh, the growth opportunity is limited or there's not enough moat in these places. But these were sectors which thrived in the public market. So it starts to also show how it's just offering another pool of capital for enterprises which traditionally would not have been able to do that if they went through the public market routes, through the VC route fundamentally. So it's that diversity of options now is extremely fascinating. And one of the points that we identified, and generally when we think about IPO exits for enterprises, we're thinking of, multi-billion, like significantly large numbers. But I think we identified about 18 IPOs out of the 39 that we tracked over that period were less than 10 million. So these were companies which were listing to get access to capital. And like Simmi mentioned, most of these companies actually have performed really well. So it's not just from the case of giving an exit, which has been the traditional way that we've looked at listing and getting to the market. Is just about accessing a new form of capital, and which is really useful for sectors where private capital does not come into.
Okay. Can you extend this a little bit? I mean, the point on sectors where VCs were not getting in, but public markets. And in general, can you talk about sectors, industries, technologies, and even individual companies as examples as you go along that caught your attention while you were researching for this report and so on, and even otherwise, as sort of in the course of your work,
Hmm.
things that kind of stood out to you as that made you sit up and say, "Hey, this is interesting. This is a sector that is now emerging or is promising," and so on.
Sure. No, absolutely. And Simi, do jump in anytime because this is quite a broad question, I think, and a lot that we can cover, and we can spend, I think, hours in this. See, I think one thing very off the bat is uh, renewables and mobility dominate this market. That's always going to be the case, at least until other sectors start maturing. And you're also seeing it based on, it's very much true to form based on the maturity of the sector and what it offers. But what we found really interesting, the renewables case, for example, is that I think we identified about five IPOs of solar cells and component players. Now, that's an indication that India's renewable story is not just about adding more capacity, which I just want to digress a bit on that. Where last year in our report, we had identified that, for India to get to this, 500 gigawatt non-fossil fuel target, we need to be adding 60 gigawatts of capacity every year. And last year, we were quite off that. But we've tracked that. I think on this year, we're at about 55 gigawatts. We're on track for that. And I think we've tracked about 137 gigawatts, which is already in pipeline, going to be executed and come online by 2027. So getting so on one level, we are at this stage wherein we're actually going to achieve a pretty significant target, which is a great thing. And it's opened up opportunity for this new whole area around the whole renewable space, which is something we've been, I think, really looking forward to, because we're, in one way, it's about developers getting backward integration on greater supply because there's just so much a greater opportunity. But it has such a cascading effect on just building a much more stronger, much more effective manufacturing supply chain element. And it also brings in so much of this other potential economic value. Think export markets, think the opportunity to just supply to other areas, especially in the global south. So it's amazing to see, like, how the renewable story in India is no longer just about adding capacity, but it's becoming this production powerhouse. It's slowly starting to get there. We still are very reliant on imports for a lot of things, obviously, but this was a really amazing trend that we found. It was very interesting because, and I think pretty much all these sectors have performed well as well. And I just want to give a perspective on how also we look to frame this report before I'll pass it over to Simi, because it may be a bit monotonous just hearing my voice speaking. We looked at it from the context, not just of, okay, here's a sector, just, you know, and this is what its core focus is. We looked at it from climate action as a system. So you have mitigation and adaptation, and we looked at mitigation as what do we do to address supply side, which is basically the sort of energy that is used and produced to which gets to what we actually end up using, and which is really the contributor from a starting point of where our GHG emissions comes in. And in this case, we also looked at sectors which can address that. And so the big ones which really stood out were, how do we electrify more of India's just, today, which is so dependent on solid fuels and direct fuels? How do we electrify more than that? Because if you kind of compare it to this increased electrification that's happening, this increased renewable adoption that's happening, logic should be that the more electrification we do, the cleaner our usage of these systems are going to be. And we also then looked at, what is exactly the demand side approach, like what are industry transitions like. Think the adoption of alternative materials, of sustainable fuels, sustainable materials, of circularity and waste opportunities. These are all elements which really can help to drive, climate action mitigation at the demand side. And then you have very strategic focused areas. Think, the option of data centers. How do you do mitigation in agriculture? Um, These are all a mix of both very emergent sectors, which have we started seeing very interesting potential coming up, and sectors which have actually also delivered pretty effectively. And the other big piece, which we introduced it last year in our report, which is around adaptation, which is really how do we build the greater resilience and greater ability to shift towards managing climate change impacts. We called it out last year and said, look, we think that this is an opportunity for private finance to come in. Traditionally, it's always been thought of as a public good. And we have seen really good examples of sectors, right, from resilient food systems, where one of the big stories that we've seen is that traditionally investing in food systems and agri has been going down. But last year, there was a significant comeback. It almost like doubled the amount of investments. And a large chunk of this, I think about 60%, was towards what we call on farm, which focuses on increasing yield, increasing productivity, which is basically an adaptation measure. And so we have sectors where today adaptation is a mainstream. It's a very investable sector. Cooling is another space that we've really been identifying. We've been working quite extensively on addressing that because heat risks is such a, it has such many multifold effects on what happens to people. So how do we address that as a significant area? And we are starting to see a lot of capital flowing from private sector towards these broader perspectives. So, and I'll let Simi pick up a few points, but the last point I want to kind of close with is that every year we have seen one of the most encouraging things about the climate story from a sector perspective in India is diversity. And we continually keep seeing that. We're seeing diversity not just in terms of the nature of capital coming in, but where capital is going. And that is so fundamental for us to be able to just build on, these success stories which are starting to come out and emerge, because it shows that things and a track record is happening and it is going forward in an effective way. But Simi, if anything stood out for you.
Yeah, I'm just gonna maybe spend a few more minutes on adaptation because I think that's becoming more and more critical. Uh, so, Hari, just to put things in context, while about 80 to 90% of climate investments go in what's mitigation outcomes, which is essentially how do you reduce emissions, and renewables and mobility are both part of that. Uh, the world is very greatly off track at this point of time to meet enough mitigation goals uh, to keep the essentially heating or warming less than 2 degrees, uh, which basically means that we are starting to see the more extreme weather events. Just this year, all almost all days, like 97% of all days from January to August had at least one extreme weather event, right? So it was either heavy rains or floods or landslides. More than 80% of Indian districts are now classified as what's called an extreme heat wave hotspot, which means that heating is something that's affecting human health at this point of time, which essentially means that uh, we can't only keep investing in mitigation, adaptation is becoming more and more critical. And there are multiple ways that we found last year in our report on how private capital can invest in adaptation. Shravan referred to sustainable food systems, and that indeed is the largest sector for adaptation from a private capital perspective. It's also a sector that almost received $500 million in investment this year. So it was a big comeback story. But I want to talk about a couple of other sectors that seem very interesting to us. Uh, One is what we generally think of as energy resilience. Uh, so while we keep building more solar, more wind, uh, what we also need to focus on is how to make sure that we keep having power and electricity if extreme weather events happen. And that's a combination of making our transmission grids more resilient, as it's called. So having, better infrastructure on how we transmit power, but also building more energy storage capacities. And we're seeing a lot of work happening with companies building battery storage, but also large projects happening around what's called a pumped hydro storage that is now getting added on to just renewable projects. So even renewable projects are now becoming more energy resilience focused. Uh, the other one that we've actually seen a lot of action in is the water sector. And this is from both access to water through different ways, right? Building water ATMs, uh, finding ways to create new kinds of water, including atmospheric water, but also kind of thinking about ways to reclaim water beyond just public infrastructure projects on sanitation. We're seeing an uptick in companies building uh, essentially B2B industrial and commercial wastewater treatment plants, which are able to reclaim grey water for usage, which then reduces freshwater usage. So you have better water availability. So that's one sector where we saw like its first IPO last year. Uh, and we are seeing many interesting private companies build in the sector. Uh, Apart from that, I think we already talked about cooling a few times, and I think that's something where we are seeing a number of different both technology and business model solutions come in. Whether it's thinking of how to make air conditioning more effective, but also if 80% of the population can't afford air conditioning, how do you then create business models? Is a cooling as a service, whether it's community models, to essentially make cooling available where heat and temperature is actually becoming a human health issue. So we're seeing now companies build interesting models around that.
Okay. Um, do you have a sense of the role of startups at this point? I mean, I guess by startups, the default is in a way VC funded startups. But even if there's the so-called bootstrap companies and so on, in general, do you have a sense of how the role of startups is changing? I mean, if there is now sort of a critical mass of enough startups to have a meaningful impact on mitigation or adaptation, especially in the Indian context.
Yeah, I'm happy to start off with that. I think absolutely. I think, but it's again very sector dependent, and one of the biggest, I think, changes that we've seen is that, you know, um, there have been talks about, funding winters, about crunches in capital coming in. And I think one of the interesting things about the nature of a climate startup is because asset heavy solutions, and this is something that, we keep repeating over and over again, but it is a fact that the nature of being an asset heavy solution in an environment and an ecosystem where it's always been that much more difficult to demonstrate opportunity and value really does build a lot of, I think, pretty strong and interesting fundamentals. Because you just imagine the life cycle of a particular solution. You have to validate at a lab stage, you got to prototype it in some sort of commercial environment, you got to then pilot it or make it into what's called a first of a kind commercial plant. So a lot of these words, like even just take the word first of a kind, you're indicating that, there is no existing alternative to what you're offering. How do you de-risk and how do you show that there is potential for such an approach to happen? And this is a very common thread for a lot of the type of companies we're talking about, because a lot of these solutions are, developing alternatives to things which are not, which are there, but these type of solutions have to emerge on their own. Like, it's not always the case, and I think it's very clearly evident. We can't just point to the same solution working in another geography where the economics or the incentives are very different, say from a policy standpoint, and India needs, a very unique and differentiated way of doing it. So I think one of the biggest things that we have seen is that we're starting to see companies which are coming out, which have really interesting fundamentals, which are able to understand that, I need to probably at times even build in a green discount. It's not just about, if I do a green product, I'm going to get a premium for it. It's that I have to be that much more competitive to demonstrate and de-risk the opportunities. And we're starting to see a lot of that thinking coming in. But one thing for sure is that, the nature of, Simi spoke about the capital stack, which is probably where we started, our climbing journey. That capital stack is still evolving. And we know that there are gaps in that capital stack, which, as as effective as an approach that you may have as a climate enterprise, as a startup, if that type of capital is not there, then it is going to be a crunch for you, no matter how effective you've been getting up to that point. And a big area, for example, where we see such a gap is that whole stage wherein you're trying to get to initial commercialization. Very often it means you're going to build in more capacity, you're going to build some sort of you're going to build some sort of plant or a facility, or you're going to build something which requires a significant amount of capex coming in. That is, that's these are the sort of areas that where today I think we're spending a lot of time to try and solve for and address. But we're able to do that because we're able to see companies coming with that same mindset, and it's making, I think, our conversation with funders and a different type of capital providers more effective to demonstrate and say that, look, this is a gap that's there in the market, and you're adjacent towards what that gap can solve. So, with just a differentiated viewpoint, potentially you could fill in that gap. I'm making it a lot more simplistic than what it is, but that's sort of the scenario that is emerging today. Yeah.
That said, to give credit where it's due, there are parts of capital stack that are getting easier. So one of the first things that startups need, Harry, is seed capital or a small amount of money to get off the ground. Let's say the first $500,000 round or 1 million round. And that is getting significantly easier for climate startups because not only are there more seed funds now, but we've seen angels and family offices jump into this in a big way. So we're just seeing like every major or even minor angel network doing climate deals at this point of time. Um, and while all the gaps exist between there to, let's say, your Series B, where you're kind of, scaling up or commercializing, once you go past that stage, even raising larger capital, which is, let's say, want to raise 25 million, you're a scaled up company, that has become easier too, because again, there are more funds who are now looking at that space. So while gaps still exist in what we call the missing middle, the both ends are getting easier for founders at this point of time.
Okay, I get that you're focused a lot more on the financial aspect or financing aspect of climate change related work. That said, I'm just wondering if you've come across examples of really sophisticated efforts to build technologies, whether it's for mitigation or for adaptation. I mean, for example, in Europe, things like direct air capture products and all are being funded with a lot of money and so on. I mean, just as one example.
Sure.
Any interesting examples like that in India? I mean, especially outside of mobility and solar and things like that.
Several we can think of. I think we've seen some very interesting examples in the sustainable fuel space, taking multiple forms of residue or waste, Harry. So it can be agri residue, it can be used cooking oil, it can be waste plastic, and then basically building new technologies, whether it's gasification, whether it's pyrolysis. These are all things that need like years of technology development, which India actually has been pretty good at, to then basically get to a product that can be used as a replacement for a fossil fuel. It can be used as either a replacement for a furnace oil or replacement for diesel, or if you can get it to like what's called industrial quality biochar, may even be used as a replacement for coal in furnaces. So it's actually, quite a lot of amazing technology that goes into getting your agri waste or organic wood waste into something that can be used as a coal replacement. And that's like, super impactful, while also being highly profitable. Uh, we are also seeing, I think, honestly, there's so much. This why I'm actually struggling to see which ones to, right?
So
The nuclear fusion one is a good example, Shravan. What do you think?
yeah, that's I mean, that's an example of amazing. Like, it's a very long tail gestation to actually get to commercialization, but we're seeing capital come in, we're seeing effectiveness to come in to take such a long term bet. And again, like Simi alluded to earlier, this is about investors understanding and knowing that, look, this is an opportunity area to get into, even though it has a long gestation period. But I think one of the other sectors that we've really seen a lot coming out is in the material space as well, where traditionally it's not got seen a lot of investments coming in, but we've also seen companies like a C6, for example, which is pretty much, it's involved to, build this whole ecosystem around seaweed production, and then made some really amazing potential solutions coming out of it, right from nutraceuticals to, alternatives to fossil fuel, basically energy source, fuel sources are alternatives to fossil fuels. And today they are a company which is pretty much, I would say, is almost like a global leader when it comes to this whole space. And that's one of the things that we really enjoy talking about. Like in India, like we don't really think India has an innovator problem. It's really the question on scale to come in. And one of the things that's, I think, really becoming a lot more effective is that there's a lot of work going towards how do you get early stage solutions and high potential solutions like this to scale up and grow. Another example is, in the battery and energy storage space, um, we have known companies who have built amazing solutions. Take in the non-lithium ion space, think flow batteries and so on. And they've been chugging and going at it, where the market opportunity and deployment has been limited because it's fundamentally only on storage. You have no EV play there. But they've been able to come to a stage where today policy has supported the adoption of non-lithium ion storage batteries at a larger scale, and today you have companies which are able to export products globally, a company like Delectric, for example, and also then basically be able to take benefit out of the local domestic market opportunity that's come in. um, the nature of solutions that we're seeing, it's kind of twofold. In one level is that really deep tech solutions take time to evolve and grow. And now we're starting to see a cusp of, emerging solutions coming in. And they're starting, the ones which started maybe in 2015 onwards, which are starting to come into that space and enter into it. And the alternative is also solutions which are really about scaling what is already technology driven, which is already established in a technology perspective. A lot of the mobility sectors like that, for example, other than, there's a lot of, we've actually been talking to folks and looking at, speaking to investors who are looking at, motors which are more efficient, rare earth free motors. And I think this whole space around materials and what you do around materials is really fascinating and interesting. Think right from the whole rare earth ecosystem, where on one level your ability to actually build without the supply chain crunches of rare earths, which we need to import at such a large level, is either going to be mitigated by finding new sources, which is a really long tail that we've seen here, or it's going to be about building alternatives to it, or it's going to be about recycling rare earths and making, extracting those values so that it stays within the ecosystem. Those last two things are probably one of the most interesting opportunity areas that we have started seeing coming up. And it's one thing we have to recognize is that a lot of the spaces outside of EVs and renewable energy are at an early stage. And a lot of the solutions that are emerging as well are solutions which are helping to address access gaps. So while deep tech solutions are starting to see their limelight, and we are also having to we also do need solutions which are able to capitalize on what's available and just make that more accessible. But that tends to be I think the larger part of what we're seeing. And it's not just always a case of, really the most innovative solution, but it's also innovative delivery mechanisms and how it's adopted, for example.
Mm. And today, do we have a general sense of, okay, I'm going to try to sort of articulate my questions, not very clear in my head, but something that I'm curious about in the sense that I want to understand, the solutions and products and services that are coming out. Currently, are they mostly aimed at, businesses, enterprises,
Yeah.
and so on,
Mhm.
or is there also a sort of a vibrant, or even a nascent ecosystem that's coming up, looking at consumer,
Consumer.
uh, products
Mm,
and services? And to your mind, how do you think that needs to evolve as you get to 2035?
mm.
I mean, does this make sense? And what are sort of the things that need to
Yes.
go into it?
No,
That's a great question.
yeah, it's something that, definitely, we think of in two different ways, right, Hari? So To answer your question more simply for things as they exist today, a lot of climate action has been B2B. And it's been B2B because one thing you've seen happen differently in India versus, let's say, Western Europe or Nordics is that the customer is often not willing or able to pay a premium for a more sustainable solution, which means that a lot of adoption that has happened in areas where something was naturally cheaper uh, than the existing option, right? When you look at, like, let's say, Amazon using electric vehicles for deliveries, it's yes, it kind of addresses their net zero goals, but it's also cheaper than using a fossil fuel vehicle at this point of time from a lifetime value perspective. Uh, so that same push, which comes from either something being cheaper or something being policy driven, right? So everything that's happening in plastic recycling or e-waste recycling is happening because there's a policy that requires to do that. That is at this point of time a very business driven demand which is happening. Uh, we've seen some platforms built for consumers to essentially build products which are like cleaner alternatives to materials, a more sustainable solution, even platforms that let you offset your carbon footprint or at least measure it. But it's at very early stage of evolution.
Yeah.
Uh,
And sorry, please.
yeah, go ahead, Shravan.
No, I was just going to add on that I think if you kind of look at from the mitigation side, so much of the need for intervention is on the business and on the enterprise side. Uh, we definitely do think that most of the need and opportunity is going to come from solutions which target that, because you have the ability of working with solutions which may not are not only, they don't just define decision making based on price and availability. Consumers predominantly, it's going to be based on value. Price is a significant factor to it. Even those who can afford it, there may be a scale question which on how much you can actually get to. So um, when you kind of look at what really is going to be driving a lot of climate action, we have to point to B2B and B2E solutions, because that also provides scaled opportunity for the enterprise as well, versus providing directly to consumers. Having said that, though, one of the companies that we've worked with closely, big fans of them. They're a solar rooftop company called Freer Energy, and what we really liked is how they've basically positioned the sale of a solar rooftop as a consumer appliance. If you really think about it, it's almost like a consumer appliance. It just happens to sit up on the roof of your house. But it's not too dissimilar towards buying any sort of air conditioner. Maybe it's slightly more expensive, but it's such an interesting take on what we've traditionally thought of as, it's emerged from a enterprise or a B2B type of solution, and now it's become a consumer solution. So this sort of shift, I think, is still going to be kind of limited, because there's also that much lesser touch points in which you can actually offer this. Maybe textiles is an opportunity. We've seen some things happening around the material, the fashion and cosmetic space, for example, and also the food space. But beyond that, the larger opportunity to build businesses is still going to be dominated by B2B and B2E solutions, enterprise solutions.
Okay. One question on the big picture context, and probably I should have asked this earlier, but still, um, today, would you agree that most experts say the 1.5-degree goal in terms of trying to curtail the increase in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees by a particular time, that is no longer viable, and most people are looking at 2 degrees and are even maybe pessimistic about that target as well. Um, and if that is the case, and in general, that taken along with other macroeconomic geopolitical changes around the world, how do you think all of that is going to affect investment decisions? When you say, we need $1 trillion heading into 2035 in India, um, so the investment decisions will be made in
Mm,
terms of supporting what kind of efforts?
sure. I'm happy to start, and Simi, please do join in. I think one thing is, whenever a country or a company takes a decision, yes, first question, I think 1.5 degrees is going to be almost impossible for us to achieve. But I think whenever a country or a company takes a decision for what their climate priorities are, it's ultimately the same. It is, how do we get to net zero? It's the pace of how we get to net zero, which is going to influence what is the temperature increase by 2100. But it's not the case that just because we don't achieve 1.5 degrees, that we're not going to still pursue and persist with this. Uh, I think what it does more is that it makes the presence and consciousness about how do we um, work towards adaptation that much more palpable and that much more important. Because what a recognition of acknowledging that we may not get to 1.5, may not get to 2 degrees, is a recognition that climate impacts by this global temperature increase is going to have maybe that much more of a cascading, intense or more frequent climate impact on everyone. So we need to build that resilience. We need to be able to build that adaptive capacity against climate impacts. So I I think in one way we feel that, look, adaptation at least is that it's, you're going to have to do it in one way or the other. Either you're going to do it at a more acute time, or you're going to do it at a time which is slightly less acute and build that resilience capacity more effectively. And to sort of ensure that adaptive capacity is, as mitigated, as lower as possible, you're going to also focus on mitigation to try and reduce your emission at some point of time. So we don't really see that it, in the broader scheme of things, the progress is going to go there. It needs to go there, but it's the pace that's the big question. Simi, if there's anything else for me.
Yes, I don't think, Hari, that takes away from folks looking to invest in climate, because even if we don't get to net zero, there is a recognition that whatever progress you can make is good progress, because you do need to reduce, or in as much as possible, avoid more extreme weather events. Uh, that said, I think as we look at adaptation forming a larger chunk of investment, which will happen 5 years or 10 years from now, um, it does change the contours of investment a little bit, because unlike mitigation, which we just said is largely been so far and we continue to be a B2B investment and B2B businesses, adaptation is really uh, largely a consumer activity, right? Or a individual activity. Yes, there is an element of how do you protect business assets from extreme weather events, but most of it is disaster relief, finding homes and employments of people who get displaced by extreme weather events, and from a more investable perspective, finding more ways to do cooling, finding more ways to find access to water, access to clean air, access to, essentially health outcomes when extreme weather events happens. All of that means that eventually climate businesses would need to build consumer focused solutions. Now, given that India has an affordability challenge while all of these extreme climate event happens, it may end up being a combination of something that brings in government as a customer rather than individuals as customers. Uh, but that's actually a good thing. We've seen that if you can bring in that uh, anchor customer that actually anchors the technology volumes and gives it sales as it grows, uh, it actually can make sure that the technology gets cheap enough for the common person to afford it, right? We saw that with LED, for example. The government came as the first large customer. And then over time, LEDs became affordable for everybody. We might see a lot of that in customer oriented technologies and solutions as adaptation becomes a bigger chunk of the climate investment.
Okay. I want to bring it back to Climake for a kind of a standard question as we begin to wrap up. Over the years, as you brought out each new edition with additional information and more research and so on, uh, anything that comes to mind in terms of how your report helped different organizations and so on? If you all want to highlight anything.
Yeah, so without naming names, I guess what we are seeing is that it has become the benchmark for many investors who are looking to understand the sector. In fact, we see many of our report slides being quoted as investment thesis as people are trying to raise new climate funds. So we hope that in some small way it has contributed to people getting more convinced that climate investment is something that's not only essential but also something that can provide returns. So it makes economic sense as well. Uh, and that has led to more companies getting funded, more funds getting built. We know of a few who have kind of used many of the insights into their thesis as they have gone out to raise capital. So I would say that is something that we have felt has been the impact in the past. Looking to the future, Hari, we believe that one trend we're definitely seeing is that many global climate funds are building not just for India, but they're trying to solve big problems, right? For example, we're seeing global biodiversity funds getting set up or global decarbonization funds getting set up, focused only on, let's say, green steel or green cement or specific areas. And we definitely see a role for climate beyond looking at India to help these funds then look at, let's say, South Asia or Southeast Asia and how the markets differ across these geographies, but in some sense answer the same climate challenges. Uh, so we're seeing some of that in our conversations as well. I think what it gets us, the report each year is a lot of feedback from market participants, be it startup founders, be it funds, be it investors in funds, on what they are building. And then that becomes a feedback loop into how to look at markets the next year. So it's definitely been very interesting evolution for Shravan and I.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Again, one more standard question. Next year's report, I mean, to the extent that
Mm.
you want to reveal it, what I'm sort of getting at is, as you have done, all this work, this entire body of work over these last several years,
Mhm.
uh, it probably has set you up or prepared you, to spot um, some really interesting things that you think will happen or come up, or um, trends or anything that you feel that you should uh, capture more information about in the coming years or pay more attention to, and so on. So even at a sort of general trend level, do you think you can give me a sense of what are some things that you would really like to go after in the coming years, not necessarily in the next report, but in the upcoming future reports?
I think one thing for sure is that I think next year we want to also look at doing a global south perspective, because one of the things, and we started doing some work towards that. It's most likely going to be a different report, but we see it as a complementary thing to identify and say what is the same lens that we've taken, which is for the India focus, which is being future focused, being data driven, trying to give direction towards capital providers. We feel that there's also an opportunity to start doing it in certain areas for the global south, and that's definitely something that we're looking to take forward and do further. Um, and I think I would say this is probably my personal thing. I haven't really run this by Simi yet, so Simi, I do apologize for putting a lot on the table. Is definitely having a bit more of a look on what the capital stack needs are, and I think that's something that we've worked on in different capacities. It may not come out as through a report output, for example, but really to start getting to outlining what exactly can be shaped up in a much more broader perspective in a more specific way, like what do the capital stacks actually look like and what they actually have to become, because there's a lot, because it's fundamentally what we're trying to do with the reports is to provide direction, provide perspectives, and that's what we're trying to do with all our work. So while it may not come out as part of the report, that's also, I think, an element of what we'd like to bring out further and see. Again, like I said, this is what I would love to definitely see further, but we also have to see how it works with what's available, what sort of information we can actually access to provide this. But the global south perspective is definitely something that we're definitely going to be looking at. Yeah.
Yeah, as always, in complete agreement here, Shravan. But I'm also curious, Hari, to see how next year reports shape up. I think this year uh, was our most upbeat report ever, right? Because things went right with climate finance and climate
Yeah.
innovation and climate startups. Uh, but a lot has changed in the last year, right? So we have had political upheavals. We've had like large development finance capital that was focused on climate go away because of certain countries pulling back from climate action. Uh, we are still tallying data, but I'll be curious to see how that affects climate issuances and investment. Uh, we don't see any difference on the ground yet. We are still seeing founders being as excited to raise capital, investors being as excited to invest in them. But I'll be curious to see how the next couple of years shape up from a climate optimism perspective.
That's it for today. I'll be back with another episode soon. To support my work, please subscribe to my posts at indiatechreport.in. I'm Hari Arakli. Thank you for listening.